At midnight, I gasped for air, lungs, burning throat convulsing, as though someone had poured fire into my chest. The hiss of the oxygen machine had gone silent, replaced by the sound of my ragged breaths clawing for survival. My eyes shot open to the fluorescent glow of the ICU room, cold, merciless light pressing down on me. Panic rushed through my body as my hands instinctively searched for the mask that was always there, the plastic cradle that had kept me alive for days. But now it was gone. My fingers brushed empty air, my vision blurred black, creeping in from the edges, and then I saw him. Victor. My stepfather loomed over me, his hand still clutching the mask he had ripped away, his eyes hard calculating, satisfied. I tried to scream, but the sound cracked into a whisper no more than a broken rasp, and through the rushing in my ears I caught the shadow at the edge of the bed. My mother, Helen. She stood still in her pale robe, arms folded, expression like stone. Not a flicker of emotion, not a muscle moved. My lips trembled, forcing out one word that scraped my throat raw. Mom, please. The plea of a daughter fighting for her life, the plea of a child still believing that a mother's love might override a monster's hand. But she did not move. She did not rush forward. She did not scream for help. She only stared, as Victor leaned closer, the sour stench of his breath flooding my senses. He whispered low, deliberate, so only I could hear. "Sign it, Clara." The papers and this. My chest convulsed, my vision turned white, my heart slammed against my ribs, desperate to push air where there was none. I could feel my body surrendering, feel my soul stretching thin between life and death. And still she stood there, silent. I reached out, clawing toward her nails, dragging across the bedsheet blood from the IV lines, smearing red streaks on the white fabric. My hand shook in the air between us, begging, praying she would take it, but she only stepped back into the shadows. The betrayal cut deeper than the suffocation, deeper than Victor's grip, deeper than any wound I had carried before. In that moment, I realized my mother had already buried me long before I stopped breathing. Why would a mother stand still while her daughter fought for every breath? Why would the woman who once kissed my scraped knees and brushed knots from my hair let a man rip away the very air I needed to live? I lay in that hospital bed tasting metal and terror, but the real wound was older than the tubes and monitors. My mother erased me long before Victor ever pulled that mask from my face. That night was not the beginning. It was the culmination of decades of silence, of manipulation, of carefully crafted erasure disguised as love. People imagine abuse as bruises and broken bones, but the truth is quieter, sharper, more insidious. It comes in the form of missing names on family documents, vanished letters, laughter that includes everyone but you. It comes in gaslighting that makes you believe you are unstable, dramatic, ungrateful. And then, when the blows finally come, no one believes you, because the story has already been rewritten. I need you to understand this was never only about one night in a hospital room. It was about every woman told to stay quiet, to be grateful, to forgive and forget, while the people who hurt her call it family. It was about the way society looks at a daughter who speaks out and says she must be overreacting, she must be bitter, she must be damaged. I am speaking now for the daughters who were told their pain was imaginary, for the sons who were branded difficult because they refused to cover up abuse, for anyone who has been rewritten by the people who should have protected them. Ask yourself this: if family is supposed to be unconditional love, then what do you call it when the people who share your blood would rather see you suffocate than lose their control? How do you rebuild your life when the foundation you were given is poison? I stared at my mother's face that night and realized she was not frozen in fear. She was not overwhelmed. She was choosing. Choosing him. Choosing silence. Choosing to let her daughter die so her marriage and her comfort would remain intact. And that is a choice no child can ever forget. That is the moment you realize that the word mother is not a guarantee of safety. It is only a title, and titles can be betrayed. That night in the ICU did not create my pain. It exposed it. It ripped the veil from years of small disappearances, from birthdays uncelebrated, from opportunities stolen from lies whispered in church pews about my instability. I was not unstable. I was suffocating long before the mask came off. And the question is not just how I survived that night. The question is what you would do if your own blood watched you die and chose silence. I did not arrive in that ICU bed overnight. The truth had been fermenting for decades, woven into the fabric of my childhood like a poison stitched into every memory. My earliest recollection of my mother Helen after she remarried was not a hug or a bedtime story. It was the sound of her laughter at Victor's jokes while I stood small in the doorway unseen. I was 8 years old when he first called me dramatic, a word my mother quickly adopted and repeated until it clung to me like a second skin. At 15, I broke a glass jar while helping in the kitchen. Victor's face turned red, his hand shot out, and in one sharp motion, he twisted my arm so hard, I heard the snap before I felt the pain. My screams ricocheted off the walls. My mother did not rush me to the hospital. She pressed a bag of frozen peas to my swelling wrist and hissed that I should stop making a scene. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how pain could be so easily dismissed if it came from the hands of someone she loved. That was the night I realized her love had conditions and I had already failed them. By 16, I had fought my way into an academic scholarship, the first real light I had ever seen at the end of the suffocating tunnel of that house. I remember standing in the kitchen holding the acceptance letter like it was a lifeline. I needed my birth certificate to complete the process. Helen slid it across the table without looking up from her coffee. I opened it eager and froze when I read the line. Father Victor Jensen. My real father had been James Meyer, killed in a car accident when I was 5. I still remembered his voice, his cedar-scented jackets, the way he let me push elevator buttons at the bank. But in ink on the most official document of my existence, he had been erased. My hand shook as I looked up. This is not right, I whispered. Helen's eyes never left her mug. For school records, she said flatly. Don't be dramatic. That phrase was her scalpel slicing away any protest, any sense of self I tried to hold. Weeks later, I waited for the scholarship packet that never came. I checked the mailbox every day, heart leaping at the sound of the metal flap. Nothing. When I asked the counselor, she looked confused, said the letter had been sent weeks earlier. I tore through Helen's sewing room that night, the one space she claimed was off limits. Buried under scraps of fabric, I found it envelope pristine, seal unbroken. I ripped it open with trembling hands. Congratulations! Terms and deadlines that had already passed. She had stolen my future before it had even begun. I confronted her, voice shaking. Why would you hide this? She did not look up from the laundry she was folding. You couldn't handle college, she said casually. I saved you from disappointment. In that moment, the world tilted. She had not forgotten. She had decided. She had already chosen the story of who I would be, and in her version, I was nothing more than a shadow in my own life. I remember my 18th birthday vividly. I baked a cake from a boxed mix, uneven frosting, but I was proud. I left it on the counter thinking maybe we would share it later. That evening, she hosted a gathering neighbors and Victor's colleagues. She took my cake scrawled in gel icing the words, "Congrats, Ethan," and set it in the center of the table. Cameras flashed, people clapped. I stood by the fridge pretending it did not matter, pretending I was not invisible on my own birthday. Ethan, my younger half-brother, the golden child, beamed under the attention. I did not hate him. He was a boy shaped by the same house but fed on praise where I was fed silence. Yet every smile directed at him carved another hollow into me. I carried that hollow to my high school graduation. I saved 2 seats, one for Helen, one for Victor. They never came. I stood outside in my cap and gown while other families hugged and posed for photos. My heels sank into the wet grass, the smell of charcoal drifting from someone's backyard barbecue. And still, I waited, certain they were just late, but the curb remained empty. The photos of that day show me smiling stiffly, 2 chairs behind me glaring in their emptiness. That was the proof that I had been erased in real time, frame by frame, milestone by milestone. By the time I was 25, I had mastered silence. Good daughters do not cause scenes. Good daughters are grateful. Good daughters do not ask why their faces vanished from family photo walls after kindergarten. I shrank myself to fit the narrative she wrote, but shrinking did not save me. It only made me easier to erase. The years rolled forward, and I collected small humiliations like stones in my pocket, each one weighing me down until breathing itself felt like disobedience. When Victor's rage erupted when Helen's silence sealed it, I told myself it was normal that survival meant obedience, until survival nearly killed me. The years between my 20s and the night in the ICU were not measured in birthdays or milestones, but in absences, in the steady drumbeat of neglect that carved itself into my bones. By 30, I had stopped expecting Helen to call on holidays. She only rang when she wanted something, usually money, or to remind me how ungrateful I was for not visiting enough. I lived in a small apartment above a laundromat, the kind of place where the smell of detergent clung to the walls and the pipes rattled when the heat came on. It was mine, though, and for a while that felt like freedom. But silence has a way of turning oppressive when it is not chosen. Every evening after work, I returned to that narrow kitchen, and the tick-tick of the wall clock, the only sound breaking the loneliness. On my 32nd birthday, I baked myself another cake, cheap vanilla frosting, one crooked candle. I did not light it. Instead, I scrolled through social media and saw photos of Helen and Victor smiling at Ethan's law school celebration. My cake grew stale on the counter while their plates were piled with catered food. The ache was familiar by then, but it still cut. The world outside thought of me as distant, difficult, unstable because Helen had spent years planting that story. At work, I overheard colleagues whisper that I was too sensitive, that I cried too easily. They did not know where those whispers began. They did not know Helen had emailed my high school teachers once, warning them that I was prone to emotional episodes that I should not be placed in leadership roles. I only learned that years later when one of those teachers admitted it with shame in her voice. Back then, all I knew was that opportunities evaporated before I could reach them. I convinced myself it was my fault, that I was indeed too dramatic. I stopped applying for promotions, stopped joining book clubs, stopped asking questions. I became a ghost who paid rent and showed up to work nothing more. The isolation deepened when Ethan graduated and moved back home temporarily. Helen's phone calls grew colder toward me, her words sharper. She spoke endlessly of Ethan's accomplishments, his brilliance, his charm. When I mentioned my new project at work, she hummed distractedly, then shifted the subject back to him. One evening she called and asked me to co-sign a loan so they could buy a larger house. My credit was solid, she said, and it would only be a formality. I asked for time to think. Victor's voice boomed in the background, sharp, threatening. So you don't trust your own family? I hung up with my heart racing, knowing that saying no would come with punishment. A week later, my email account was hacked, attempts made to reroute my paycheck. My bedroom door lock showed scratches like someone had tested a key. Nothing was stolen, but I found a small black pinhole camera taped under my dresser shelf, blinking green. My skin crawled as I yanked it out and drowned it in a glass of water. I called Helen, voice trembling with fury. Was that supposed to scare me? Her sigh carried more disdain than fear. A good daughter does not keep secrets, she said coldly, especially not in my house. I hung up, shaking my body, buzzing with the kind of terror that masquerades as clarity. They wanted access to my life, every corner of it, and when I resisted, they punished me with intrusion and sabotage. I did not sleep that night, sitting by the locked door with a chair braced under the handle, clutching my phone like a weapon. My breaths were shallow, uneven, the echo of that future moment in the ICU already haunting me. I was suffocating before the mask was ever ripped away. The hospital incident only made the suffocation visible to others. In the months before it happened, I had felt myself unraveling. I worked long hours but returned home too tired to cook, too tired to clean. My fridge held nothing but expired yogurt and a half-empty jug of milk. Bills piled on the table. On weekends, I sometimes sat on the couch staring at the blank wall for hours, my thoughts circling back to one cruel truth. If I disappeared, no one would notice, except as an inconvenience. And yet, despite the despair, I clung to fragments of hope. I kept a small notebook hidden in a drawer, where I wrote lists of the ways Helen had erased me. The scholarship letter, the altered birth certificate, the cake that became Ethan's, the empty seats at graduation. Each entry was like a pin in a map charting the geography of my erasure. I did not know what I would do with it, only that writing it down felt like reclaiming pieces of myself. But even hope can feel like betrayal when your body is breaking down. One winter night, I collapsed in the kitchen, chest-tight, vision spinning. The doctor said it was stress compounded by untreated pneumonia. They admitted me for observation, fitted me with oxygen to help my lungs recover. I should have felt safe under the sterile glow of hospital lights, but safety was a language my family had erased. When I opened my eyes at midnight and found Victor's shadow bending over me, the mask ripped away and Helen standing silent, I understood that isolation had prepared me for this. I was not shocked at her silence. I was only devastated by how unsurprising it was. The night Victor tore away my oxygen mask should have been my last. A nurse named Julia saved me bursting into the room after hearing the irregular beeping on the monitor. She shoved Victor back with more courage than her small frame should have held, reattached the mask, and shouted for security. By the time guards arrived, Victor was gone, and Helen had melted into the hallway like smoke. Julia pressed a hand to my shoulder, her voice urgent, asking if I was stable, if I wanted to report what had happened. My throat burned with the weight of silence, the familiar paralysis of wondering who would believe me if I spoke. But something shifted in that moment. The sound of Julia's voice was not pity, it was alarm. She had seen it with her own eyes. I was not crazy, I was not dramatic. I was a victim of an attempted murder in a hospital room. For the first time I had a witness. I decided then I would not bury this one in silence. Days later, discharged with lungs still raw and body weak, I returned to my apartment and opened the notebook where I had been scribbling fragments of my stolen life. I spread the pages across the table, a map of betrayal staring back at me. This time, instead of closing it, I began to add more. I printed copies of my altered birth certificate and placed them in a folder labeled Identity Theft. I retrieved the old scholarship letter, still creased from the night I found it hidden, slid it into another folder labeled Opportunity Stolen. I dug out the photo of my high school graduation, the 2 empty seats circled in red ink, and labeled it Absence Documented. Each artifact was proof, not just memory. I organized them with trembling hands, afraid that even the paper might vanish if I did not hold it tightly enough. Maya re-entered my life, then a friend I had not seen since we were teenagers. She messaged me after hearing rumors about the hospital incident. She asked if we could meet. At first, I hesitated, sure Helen had poisoned her against me years ago. But when we sat across from each other at a coffee shop, Maya's eyes were steady, filled not with suspicion, but sorrow. She admitted she had believed Helen's stories back then, that I was unstable, too intense. But now, hearing what happened, she saw the pattern clearly. She told me she knew a lawyer, Daniel Cross, who specialized in cases of domestic abuse and coercive control. I felt a tremor of both fear and hope. I had never spoken these things out loud to someone willing to believe. That night I called Daniel. His voice was calm, practical. He did not question whether I was exaggerating. He asked for evidence. He said the paper trail would outlive the lies. I gathered everything. Julia agreed to testify that she saw Victor rip away the oxygen mask. Mr. Coleman, the neighbor, who had once witnessed Victor twisting my arm, agreed to provide a statement. Maya helped me retrieve emails from high school teachers showing Helen had described me as unstable years earlier. Daniel coached me to save every voicemail, every text, every document. He said it was not only about telling the truth, it was about proving it in a language the court would understand. I filled binders with color-coded tabs, identity medical surveillance witnesses. Each page I inserted felt like a piece of my life I had been told to forget, but now reclaimed. But the closer I came to building the case, the more dangerous the retaliation grew. Ethan, my golden child brother, messaged me with veiled threats. "Stop being difficult, Clara. You're tearing the family apart." I did not reply. One night I returned home to find a manila envelope slid under my door. Inside were mortgage documents, my name highlighted, a sticky note in Victor's block handwriting. "Let's put this behind us. Just sign." I held the papers over the sink, lit a match, and watched them curl into ash. The smoke curled into my lungs, acrid and bitter but cleansing. I knew then that their tactics had not changed. They wanted my signature, my silence, my compliance. They would weaponize my credit, my identity, my very breath to keep control. But I was done being erased. I contacted Daniel again, told him I was ready. We drafted a civil suit against Helen for emotional abuse, interference with educational opportunity, coercive control. We drafted a restraining order against Victor for attempted murder. I signed every page with a hand that no longer trembled. As I worked, I remembered moments that had once seemed small but now burned with clarity. Helen smiling while Victor berated me. Helen whispering in church that I was troubled, ensuring sympathy for herself while planting doubt about me. The birthday cake with Ethan's name written over mine. The graduation chairs left empty. None of it was random. It was a pattern, deliberate, precise. She had not lost control. She was the control. That realization filled me with both fury and resolve. I pinned copies of everything on the wall of my apartment, connected them with red string. A web of truth that might look like conspiracy to outsiders, but to me was a lifeline. It was not paranoia. It was memory organized into evidence. And for the first time, the evidence was louder than her lies. I knew the confrontation was coming. Helen had always been adept at spinning narratives, convincing neighbors and friends that she was the victim of an ungrateful daughter. But this time I had more than words. I had documents, witnesses, recordings. I had proof that silence had nearly killed me, and I had no intention of being silent ever again. The courthouse did not look like a battlefield, but I carried my binder like a shield, every page inside a weapon forged from years of silence. Maya drove me that morning, her hand gripping the steering wheel tighter than mine, her jaw set as though she were the one about to testify. Daniel met us on the courthouse steps, his tie crooked, his eyes sharp. He asked if I was ready. I told him I had been ready since the night I almost died. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the hallway smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. My shoes echoed against the linoleum as I walked toward the courtroom, each step deliberate despite the tremor in my legs. When the doors opened, I saw them. Helen sat at the defense table in a pastel pink suit, her hair perfectly curled, her lips curved into a faint smile that did not touch her eyes. She looked like a woman attending a luncheon, not a mother accused of erasing her daughter's life. Beside her, Victor sat rigid, jaw-clenched eyes scanning the room like a soldier waiting for orders. Ethan was not there. I wondered if he had chosen absence to protect himself, or because he could no longer bear the weight of the lies. The judge called my name. Plaintiff Clara Jensen. The words landed like a stone in water, sending ripples through the room. I took the stand, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. My voice did not shake when I began. I told them about the scholarship letter hidden in a drawer, about the birth certificate altered to erase my real father, about the cake transformed into Ethan's celebration, about the empty seats at my graduation. I told them about years of gaslighting, about being labeled unstable, about doors scratched by attempted intrusions, about the pinhole camera blinking in my bedroom. And then I told them about that night in the ICU. My breath faltered as I described the mask torn from my face, Victor's whisper demanding my signature, my mother standing silent. The room grew so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Daniel handed the judge the hospital surveillance footage Julia had retrieved, grainy but clear enough to show Victor's hand ripping the mask away, clear enough to show Helen in the corner, arms folded, unmoving. Julia testified next, her voice steady as she recounted how she rushed in, reattached the mask, saw Helen's blank expression. Mr. Coleman followed, describing the night years ago, when Victor twisted my arm until it broke. Then came the emails from my teachers, proof that Helen had deliberately branded me unstable to sabotage my opportunities. Each piece of evidence stacked like bricks in a wall too high for them to climb. Helen's lawyer, an older man in an expensive suit, rose with practiced calm. He asked if I considered myself emotional. I am human, I replied evenly. He smirked, tried again. Would you say you exaggerate situations? I looked him in the eye and said, if I were exaggerating, this binder would be empty. He opened his mouth, but Daniel interrupted, sliding forward the necklace I wore as a child, a silver star. He placed beside it a dated receipt in my father's handwriting, a letter from James Meyer, my real father, instructing Helen to give me the gift and tell me it was from him. Helen had told me it was hers. The judge studied the documents, then turned her gaze to Helen. For the first time, Helen's mask cracked. Her lips tightened. Her eyes flickered downward, refusing to meet mine. Victor's facade broke too. He slammed a hand on the table, muttering that this was a witch hunt. The judge silenced him with a gavel strike. My testimony ended, but my truth lingered in the air, undeniable. Daniel delivered the closing argument with precision. He said this was not a case of misunderstandings or family disagreements. This was a pattern of psychological manipulation, deliberate obstruction of opportunity, and attempted murder. He said I was not asking for pity. I was demanding justice. When the judge delivered her ruling, the room seemed to hold its breath. She declared the claim substantiated. Victor was guilty of attempted murder, sentenced to 10 years in prison. Helen was liable for emotional damages and compensatory restitution. The restraining order was granted immediately. My knees nearly buckled, but I stood tall, the words echoing like a hymn I had waited my whole life to hear. Outside the courtroom, reporters snapped photos. Neighbors whispered, some shaking their heads, others nodding. I felt the weight of eyes on me, but for once I did not shrink. I met their gaze. Let them see. Let them know. Helen exited with her lawyer, her face pale, her smile gone. Victor was led away in cuffs, his fury impotent against the steel on his wrists. For years they had written the story of who I was, silenced my voice, erased my name. In that courthouse, I wrote it back in ink no one could erase. The verdict was only the beginning. Justice in words is powerful, but justice in consequences is what makes the world finally tilt toward truth. Victor was handcuffed in front of the entire courtroom, his body stiff with outrage, but the chains clinking at his wrists told a story louder than his curses. 10 years in prison meant no more control over me, no more looming shadow at family gatherings, no more threats disguised as fatherly authority. The newspaper in town printed his mugshot under the headline, "Local Veteran Sentenced for Attempted Murder of Stepdaughter." For a man who had built his reputation on discipline and service, it was the ultimate humiliation. Former colleagues cut ties. Business partners dissolved contracts. His name, once barked with respect, became a cautionary whisper. Helen's fall was slower, more insidious, but no less devastating. She lost her job within weeks. Officially, the dental practice claimed restructuring, but the truth moved through town like wildfire. Patients did not want their administrator to be a woman found guilty of coercive control and emotional abuse against her own child. The church she had clung to for social validation asked her quietly not to return. The sympathy she had milked for years dried up. Old acquaintances called me to say they had always suspected something, that they regretted believing her lies. Each message was bittersweet, a reminder of how thoroughly she had controlled the narrative, but also proof that the narrative was finally cracking. Ethan tried to remain silent, hoping to ride out the storm. But silence once my prison became his undoing. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with the golden child of a disgraced family. The law firm that had offered him a prestigious internship rescinded the offer, citing reputation concerns. He sent me a single text weeks after the trial. I didn't know. "I'm sorry. I believe you." I read it over and over, the words both too little and somehow more than I ever expected. I did not reply. Apologies do not erase years of complicity, even silent complicity. But for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe he too had been a pawn in Helen's design. Still, I could not carry his guilt for him. The consequences reached further than our bloodline. Neighbors who once nodded politely now crossed the street when Helen passed. Former friends whispered not about my instability, but about her cruelty. The narrative had shifted, and this time I did not have to scream to be heard. The evidence screamed for me. For myself, the consequences were quieter, but profound. I received the house my father had left me, the one Helen and Victor had tried to fold into their assets. Walking through its rooms for the first time, I felt both grief and triumph. The air smelled of dust and cedar, faint echoes of him lingering in the wood. I found a box tucked in the closet, old photographs of him holding me as a baby, images Helen had hidden. Tears blurred my vision. as I realized how much of him I had been denied. Now those memories were mine again, tangible proof that I had not imagined his love. I began repairs on the house one board at a time. Each nail I hammered in felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Justice had not given me back the years stolen, but it had given me a foundation for the years ahead. The town, small and hungry for gossip, continued to murmur about Helen's downfall. Some pitied her, others despised her, but all agreed her silence that night in the ICU had cost her everything. Victor's sentencing hearing was televised locally, the footage of him being led away replayed on the evening news. I watched it once, then turned off the television. I did not need to gloat. Knowing he would wake every morning in a cell was enough. Justice was not revenge. It was balance restored. For Helen, there was no prison, no orange jumpsuit, only the slow erosion of her carefully crafted image. That in some ways seemed a crueler fate. She had thrived on perception, on the applause of neighbors, and the sympathy of friends. Now, when people looked at her, they saw not a devoted mother, but a woman who had chosen silence while her daughter suffocated. They saw complicity. They saw cowardice. And she could not spin that truth away. I learned later that she moved out of town unable to withstand the whispers. But whispers travel. Wherever she went, she carried the weight of exposure. I no longer cared. For once, her story was not my burden. Consequences had finally attached themselves to the right names. 3 months after the trial, I stood in the living room of my father's old house, with sunlight filtering through lace curtains, dust motes swirling like tiny stars. For the first time in decades, silence did not terrify me. It was not heavy or oppressive. It was peace, the kind that fills a room once the storm has passed. I had painted the walls a pale blue, the color of sky on clear mornings, a color that reminded me there was still expanse left in my life. Rebuilding began not with grand gestures, but with small decisions. I replaced the broken locks on the doors, not out of paranoia, but out of ownership. I bought secondhand furniture, mismatched, but chosen by me. Each item was a declaration. This space belongs to me, not to them. I started therapy, something I had avoided for years, because Helen had once told me therapy was for unstable people, and that seeking help would only prove her right. Sitting across from a woman who listened without judgment, I realized how deeply those lies had burrowed into me. Week after week, I unpacked the memories I had been forced to bury. I cried for the girl who baked her own birthday cake, for the teenager who waited on a curb in her graduation gown, for the woman gasping for air in a hospital bed while her mother stood silent. Healing was not linear. Some mornings I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced I could still feel Victor's hand tearing the mask from my face. But other mornings I woke to birdsong and coffee brewing and realized I was still here, still breathing, and no one could take that from me again. Slowly, I began to reach outward. Maya encouraged me to attend a community support group for survivors of domestic and familial abuse. At first, I sat in the back listening to stories spill out of strangers who felt like mirrors. A woman who had been told she was too emotional to be believed. Another whose family called her dramatic when she left her abusive husband. A girl no older than 17 who whispered that her stepmother monitored her phone calls. Their pain braided with mine, and for the first time I felt less alone. One evening when the facilitator asked if anyone wanted to share, I heard my own voice say yes. I told them about the night in the ICU, about Helen's silence, about years of gaslighting and erasure. I told them I had built a binder of evidence and faced them in court. When I finished, the room was silent, not with disbelief, but with recognition. Then one woman leaned forward, eyes wet, and said quietly, "You gave me courage." That moment lit a fire in me. I began volunteering at the center, helping organize meetings, listening when newcomers stumbled over their stories. I created a workshop called Silent No More, a place where survivors could document their own truths in whatever form they chose, journals, art letters. I wanted them to understand that putting truth on paper was not just catharsis, it was armor. At the first workshop, a teenage girl lingered after everyone else had left. She wore an oversized sweatshirt, her eyes darting nervously. When I asked if she was okay, she whispered, "I still live with her." She did not say who her was. She did not need to. I recognized that posture, that fear. I unclasped the necklace that had once been stolen from me and pressed into her palm. "You don't have to keep it forever," I told her, "just until you're ready to let go." She nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Watching her slip the chain around her neck felt like closing a circle, giving someone else what I once needed most: proof that survival was possible. My world widened after that. I reconnected with colleagues, applied for a promotion I had once convinced myself I could not handle, and got it. I filled the house with books, music, plants that stretched toward the sunlight as though teaching me how to reach. I even began to write long essays about gaslighting, about how silence can be deadlier than fists, about how chosen family can heal wounds bloodline never will. One of my essays was published in a local paper, and messages poured in from strangers thanking me for putting into words what they could not. Each message was a reminder that my story did not end in that hospital room. It began there. Rebuilding was not about erasing what happened. It was about building a life sturdy enough to carry it without breaking. Helen and Victor had tried to make me vanish. Instead, they had made me visible in ways they never intended. I was no longer the erased daughter. I was the woman who lived, who spoke, who built something from the ashes they left. And every breath I took was proof that they had failed. Winter came early that year, the kind that painted frost on every window pane and turned sidewalks into sheets of glass. One morning, I walked to the park near my father's house, the same park I had visited as a child, and sat on a bench overlooking the pond. The geese cut ripples through the icy water, their cries sharp in the cold air. I pulled out my journal, nearly full, now every page heavy with ink and memory. On the last page, I wrote a sentence that had taken me years to believe. "You do not need an apology to heal. You need proof you lived through it." I tore the page out carefully, folded it into the shape of a paper crane, and let the wind carry it from my hands. It fluttered above the water, landed lightly on the edge, and drifted until it sank. Watching it disappear, I felt no grief, only release. Somewhere in another town, Helen might still be rehearsing her story, telling anyone who would listen that I was dramatic, ungrateful, unstable. But the difference now was that her story no longer mattered. She had lost her power when the gavel came down, when the evidence spoke louder than her lies. Victor woke every morning behind bars, counting the years he had once believed he could steal from me. Ethan, though spared legal punishment, carried the weight of truth, a mirror he could no longer avoid. And me, I carried scars, yes, but also strength. The lesson was brutal, but undeniable. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by who shows up when you are gasping for air. Maya sat with me that evening as the sun set behind the bare trees. She poured us both tea from a thermos, steam curling into the frigid sky. She said, "You saved more than yourself, Clara. You redefined what family means for all of us." I let her words settle, not rushing to answer. For once, silence was not emptiness, it was fullness. In that stillness, I understood that justice is not fireworks or applause. Justice is steady, it is deliberate. It is living in a house that was almost taken from you and calling it yours again. Justice is breathing without fear that someone will rip the mask away. Healing did not mean forgetting Helen's silence or Victor's violence. It meant building a life where their shadows no longer dictated my every step. It meant turning my story into a lantern for others walking the same dark road. And so I kept speaking, kept writing, kept reminding anyone who would listen that silence does not protect you, truth does. When people ask me now what it felt like to watch my mother stand still while I suffocated, I tell them it felt like dying. But what came after fighting, proving, rebuilding, felt like living for the first time. My story is not only mine. It belongs to anyone who has been erased, anyone who has been told their pain was imaginary, anyone who has been betrayed by the people meant to love them most. If you have ever gasped for air while your own family looked away, know this: you are not alone. You are not crazy, and you can reclaim your name. Family is not always blood. Sometimes family is the friend who drives you to court, the nurse who reattaches your oxygen mask, the stranger who says, "I believe you." Those are the people whose silence will never be complicit, whose presence will never be conditional. Those are the people worth keeping. As I left the park that night, street lamps casting halos of light on the frozen ground, I whispered to myself, a vow, never again will I be erased. My mother's silence almost killed me, but my voice saved me. And now my voice will not be quiet again.